The morning began with the quiet hum of the suburban street, a neighborhood built on symmetry and silence. The lawns were trimmed to perfection, the mailboxes painted in uniform beige, and every flower bed arranged according to the Homeowners Association's handbook. It was the kind of place where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. The sun had barely climbed above the rooftops when the ground began to tremble. At first it felt like the rumble of a distant truck, the kind that passes by and disappears into the morning haze. But the sound didn't fade, it grew louder, deeper, angrier. Then came the unmistakable roar of machinery. Bulldozers, excavators, trucks loaded with gravel and dust. By the time the owner of the small, single-story home on Willow Lane stepped outside, the chaos had already begun. Bright yellow machines lined the street, and men in neon vests barked orders to one another over the roar of engines. Without warning, they had begun tearing down the white picket fence. The flower beds were crushed under heavy tires, and before anyone could react, the first wall came down, splintering wood, cracking glass, and a cloud of dust rising like smoke from a battlefield. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, whispering and filming with their phones, some in shock, others in quiet approval. The HOA board members stood nearby, arms crossed, their badges gleaming in the sun like small emblems of authority. They watched as the bulldozers leveled the structure, calm, composed, and proud of their decision. They claimed the house had violated code. Unapproved renovations, improper fencing, landscaping that didn't meet aesthetic standards, excuses stacked like bricks in their justification. But there had been no letter, no fine, no hearing, no warning at all. By noon, the home was nothing but debris, an unrecognizable pile of memories and ruin. Dust hung in the air, settling on nearby cars, staining everything with the residue of destruction. The HOA president, a woman named Marlene Carter, stood with her clipboard, surveying the wreckage like a general after a successful siege. She smiled faintly, satisfied that another non-compliant property had been dealt with. To her, this was progress, a step closer to a perfectly controlled community. But what she didn't know was that this act of arrogance had set something in motion far greater than any of them could imagine. Later that day, as the last of the machines rolled away, a black SUV pulled up to the site. The man who stepped out didn't shout or curse. He simply stared at the ruins for a long moment. The dust clung to his boots as he walked the perimeter, silent and calculating. The neighbors recognized him, the homeowner. But what they didn't know, what the HOA would soon regret discovering, was that this wasn't just his home. This was the heart of something much bigger. He pulled a single folder from his vehicle. Inside were deeds, maps, and ownership documents that traced back decades. His father's signature, his grandfather's name, lines of ink that told a story of legacy and control. The house might have been gone, but his ownership of the land, the entire block, remained untouched. As the sun began to set behind the rows of identical houses, he turned his gaze toward the HOA office across the street. Its glass windows reflected the orange light, making it look like it was burning. He didn't need to speak. The look in his eyes said everything. They had bulldozed his house, but in doing so, they had bulldozed their own future. Because now, the real power in this neighborhood wasn't sitting behind an HOA desk. It was standing quietly among the ruins, planning his revenge. That night, the once perfect suburb was wrapped in silence again. But beneath that silence was tension, a low hum of something electric and dangerous, the kind of calm that comes before a storm. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, a decision was made, one that would soon shake the foundation of the HOA itself. What began as a careless demolition was about to become a full-scale war for control. The HOA had no idea that the man they had just wronged wasn't just another homeowner. He was the landlord of their entire illusion, the block, the land beneath their houses, the ground their power stood on. It was all his, and soon they would learn what it meant to destroy something that belonged to him. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to an eerie calm, the kind that sits heavy in the air, too still to be peaceful. The lot where the house once stood was now a jagged scar on the street, a crater of dust, splintered wood, and shattered concrete. But what the neighbors didn't see was the storm quietly forming behind it. The man, whose name few truly knew, spent the day walking the perimeter, marking measurements, inspecting every inch of damage. The HOA believed the demolition was final, that the mess was his to clean up. But every scrape of his boot across the dirt, every note he jotted in his worn black notebook, was a step toward something much larger. He wasn't rebuilding, he was preparing. In the HOA office, the board was in celebration mode. Marlene Carter, the president, stood by the window sipping her morning coffee, watching the dust settle like the aftermath of a victory parade. To her, the removal of the eyesore had restored the order of the block. The house had always stood out, different siding, unapproved renovations, and that small hand-built porch that never matched their guidelines. She called it a rebellion against structure. Now it was gone, and she felt untouchable. The other members buzzed around her, discussing next week's agenda, new landscaping rules, and a motion to install cameras at the entrance of the neighborhood. Not one of them knew that the land they managed so confidently was no longer theirs to dictate. Across the street, the man's lawyer arrived. A woman in a dark gray suit stepped out of her car with a stack of folders and a calmness that came from certainty. She joined him on the lot, exchanging only quiet nods. The two stood there for nearly an hour, reviewing documents, tracing property lines on the map spread across the hood of the SUV. One by one, the truth began to unfold. The entire street, from Willow Lane to Pine Drive, was built on land his family had owned for over 70 years. The HOA's developer had only purchased building rights, not the full deed to the ground beneath. It was an oversight buried in decades of paperwork, missed by every board that came after. Now, with a single legal motion, that oversight could become a weapon. By noon, he had filed a formal complaint and sent legal notices to the county office. The documents weren't loud or dramatic, just cold, precise, and devastatingly clear. Ownership records were to be reviewed, titles reevaluated, construction permits frozen pending verification. The HOA didn't realize it yet, but their authority was already crumbling. That evening, the man drove around the neighborhood in silence. Every house that once seemed so proud now looked fragile, their perfect lawns and matching shutters masking a truth they didn't yet understand. He noted each one who lived there, who was on the HOA board, which properties sat directly on his land. He wasn't looking for vengeance in the form of chaos. He wanted control, power, the kind that didn't scream but simply existed, absolute, unchallengeable. By sunset, a thick packet of documents arrived at Marlene Carter's home. She found it on her porch, sealed and stamped with a legal insignia. At first, she thought it was another complaint from a resident, maybe about trash collection or parking violations. But when she opened it, her confidence began to fracture. Inside were certified copies of land deeds, his name printed cleanly across every one. Not just the lot where his house stood, but every parcel of land the HOA managed. Every sidewalk, every garden, even the park with the fountain she had proudly commissioned last year. The man they had labeled non-compliant wasn't a rebellious homeowner, he was their landlord. Panic rippled through the HOA office that night. Emergency meetings were called, lawyers were consulted, but nothing could undo what had already been done decades ago. The paper trail was unbroken and airtight. Their entire foundation, literal and legal, was built on borrowed land. For the next few days, silence returned to the block. The neighbors watched the empty lot from behind curtains, whispering rumors. Some said he planned to rebuild, others said he was selling, but the truth was far more dangerous. The man didn't want to rebuild, he wanted to reclaim. Heavy trucks began appearing at odd hours, delivering steel beams and crates marked survey equipment. Workers in plain clothing took measurements and drove stakes into the ground. It wasn't construction, it was assessment. Preparation for something larger than anyone on that street could comprehend. The HOA sent notices demanding permits and explanations, but each letter was returned unopened, marked with a single red stamp: invalid jurisdiction. Their authority was dissolving, one envelope at a time. And while they scrambled to regain control, he was already several steps ahead, reviewing architectural plans, contacting developers, and negotiating quietly with investors who had once dismissed him. The same land that the HOA thought they ruled was now being valued in millions. He had waited long enough for them to dig their own grave. Now he was ready to fill it. By the end of the week, Marlene stood once more at the edge of the lot, watching as new survey flags fluttered in the breeze. She tried to maintain her composure, but the weight of uncertainty was visible in her trembling hands. The man appeared across the street, standing still, arms folded, watching her. There were no words, no gestures, just a look that said everything. The power had shifted, and for the first time Marlene Carter understood that the house they destroyed wasn't the end of a problem. It was the beginning of their downfall. In the days to come, they would discover just how far he was willing to go to take back what was his. The HOA had played with authority. Now they would learn what it meant to face ownership. The neighborhood had changed. Not visibly, not yet, but something deep in its foundation had shifted. The air felt heavier, the silence thicker. Neighbors still waved politely in the mornings, but their smiles were brittle, their eyes darting to the empty lot that had once held a home. It had become a symbol now, a wound that refused to close. For the HOA, the wound was beginning to fester. Marlene Carter spent her days in the association office surrounded by chaos. The boardroom, once orderly and smug, had turned into a battlefield of paperwork. Piles of legal notices, warnings, and land inquiries filled every inch of the table. The more they tried to assert control, the more tangled they became in the web of ownership they had ignored for years. It was all real. Every deed, every signature, every recorded document. The man they had wronged wasn't bluffing. He owned the land, the streets beneath their cars, the sidewalks beneath their mailboxes, and even the manicured lawns they prided themselves on. The HOA had bulldozed his home on property that never truly belonged to them. The arrogance that had defined their authority was beginning to crack. Yet Marlene refused to accept defeat. She told the board they had to fight it, that this was just a technicality, a loophole that could be patched with the right influence. She had connections in the city office, friends who owed her favors, but every attempt to interfere was met with the same response. The ownership documents are clear. For the man, this was the moment he had waited for. While the HOA drowned in paperwork, he moved quietly and efficiently. Every day, new trucks arrived, not with demolition equipment but with survey teams, soil analysts, and construction consultants. He filed plans under a new development company, one registered under his name alone. The project was ambitious, a complete redevelopment of the block. The residents thought it was a bluff, a scare tactic meant to intimidate the HOA. But soon, letters began arriving in mailboxes, formal, legally binding notices informing homeowners that their land leases were being reassessed. The fine print made it clear. Their occupancy was conditional on his continued consent. Panic spread like fire. At the next HOA meeting, attendance overflowed. Neighbors packed into the room, demanding answers, voices rising in panic and anger. Marlene stood at the front, her face pale, her confidence gone. She tried to reassure them, but the fear in the room drowned her words. Some residents turned on her, accusing her of overreach, of arrogance, of ruining everything. Outside, the man stood beneath a streetlight, watching the meeting unfold through the glass. He didn't need to be inside. The chaos was proof that his plan was working. The power he had lost when they bulldozed his home was returning, one signature, one panic-filled conversation at a time. He wasn't seeking vengeance in anger, he was executing it with precision. Within weeks, legal notices evolved into offers. Homeowners were given a choice: sell their homes to him at fair market value or face the end of their land lease agreements. It wasn't coercion, it was law, and the law was entirely on his side. Most resisted at first, but resistance turned into hesitation and hesitation into fear. As property values dropped under legal uncertainty, the pressure became unbearable. The HOA couldn't protect them. The banks grew nervous. The residents began to break one by one. Marlene watched in horror as the first family moved out, their moving truck loaded in silence, avoiding her gaze. Then another, and another. The perfect neighborhood she had built, the community she had ruled with such confidence, was collapsing from the inside out. Meanwhile, on the empty lot where it all began, the man began construction. The first foundation poured wasn't a home, it was an office. His office. A sleek, modern structure of steel and glass, rising like a monument to his patience and power. Neighbors whispered as they passed. Some called it revenge. Others called it justice. Inside that building, plans spread across the tables, a complete redevelopment of the neighborhood. A new shopping complex, luxury apartments, private homes under his management alone. The HOA's bylaws, its rules, its entire existence would be obsolete. When the city inspectors came, they didn't meet resistance. They met paperwork so clean, so thorough, that there was no question who controlled the land. Permits were approved swiftly, licenses signed without delay. And the HOA, their complaints were dismissed as invalid. Their appeals went nowhere. It was the perfect reversal. Months earlier, they had sent bulldozers to destroy a man's home, believing their rules made them untouchable. Now, he was dismantling their kingdom not with machines, but with paper, ink, and silence. Marlene began to unravel. She spent her nights staring out the window of her once pristine home, watching the construction lights flicker across the street. Each new foundation was another reminder of her failure. The power she once wielded had turned to dust. Her calls to the county office went unanswered. Her board members began resigning, one after another. What was left of the HOA was just her, and a few frightened loyalists clinging to a sinking ship. Then came the final blow. One morning, a courier arrived at her doorstep with a thick envelope. Inside was a single-page document titled Notice of Reclamation. The message was short, but devastatingly clear. The land beneath her home now fell under the jurisdiction of his development company. Her house, like every other on the street, would soon be part of the redevelopment project. She stood frozen, staring at the paper, realizing that the man she had wronged had done what no one thought possible. He had turned their own arrogance into a weapon. And the worst part, he hadn't raised his voice once. That night, the construction continued under bright floodlights, echoing through the quiet streets. The sound wasn't just the noise of machines. It was the sound of power shifting, of justice unfolding in slow, deliberate motion. The man stood on his balcony overlooking the site, the wind carrying the faint hum of engines. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply watched. The HOA had destroyed his house without warning. Now he was erasing their existence, one property at a time. By the time summer arrived, the neighborhood had changed beyond recognition. The once pristine lawns were unkempt, the trimmed hedges now wild, and the once glossy HOA office windows stood dark and lifeless. The perfect illusion of order had crumbled, leaving behind the bones of a community built on arrogance. Where there had once been silence and uniformity, now there was movement, steel, dust, and construction noise echoing from dawn until dusk. The man's development was in full swing. Excavators dug deep foundations while survey teams worked under glowing halogen lights. Every sound that reverberated through those quiet streets was a reminder that power had shifted hands permanently. Marlene Carter, once the unshakable queen of the HOA, had become a ghost in her own domain. Her morning walks were no longer greeted with waves or smiles, just distant stares and closed curtains. Neighbors who once praised her for keeping the block perfect now avoided her, muttering under their breath that she had doomed them all. Inside her home, the walls that had once held awards, plaques, and HOA certificates now looked bare. Most of her board members had resigned, and those who hadn't were too frightened to answer her calls. They all knew it was over. The association had no power, no funds, and no legal standing. Their accounts were frozen pending investigation into unauthorized demolitions, an investigation sparked by the man himself. He didn't need to raise his voice or file a lawsuit. The truth did the work for him. City officials reviewed the demolition orders the HOA had authorized. They found no signatures from the owner, because the HOA had never sought his permission. The paperwork was forged through internal manipulation, rushed approvals, and personal ambition. And now it was unraveling in public view. The story began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations ran segments titled "Home Destroyed by HOA, Owner Fights Back." Camera crews arrived, and suddenly Marlene's fortress of control was invaded by journalists and flashing microphones. Every detail of her abuse of power was dissected and broadcast. While she hid behind drawn blinds, the man remained calm and composed, refusing interviews but allowing the truth to speak for itself. He didn't need fame. He wanted legacy. In the midst of chaos, construction on his property reached its first milestone. The steel frame of his new complex rose above the rooftops, a modern monument towering over the remnants of the HOA's failed dominion. It wasn't just architecture. It was symbolism made of glass and concrete. At its center stood a large stone sign engraved with the name of his development company, Willow Holdings. The name was deliberate, taken from the very street where they had bulldozed his home. From that building, he began acquiring properties one by one. Each purchase was strategic, silent, and irreversible. Some residents sold willingly, afraid, exhausted, or simply resigned. Others resisted until legal pressure forced them out. One by one, the houses that once formed the HOA's pride were stripped of their old identities, boarded up, and marked for demolition. And through it all, he never once confronted them directly. His silence was more powerful than their threats had ever been. Marlene watched it all unfold from her living room window. Every passing truck, every crane lifting steel beams felt like a personal attack. The sound of progress had become her torment. She tried desperately to fight back, filing injunctions, demanding hearings, but the law no longer recognized her authority. The HOA's charter was revoked, its legal standing dissolved. Her emails went unanswered. Her power was gone. One evening, she ventured out for the first time in weeks, walking to what was once the HOA office. The glass door was locked, the sign removed, and the inside stripped bare. Desks gone, files gone. Only the hollow echo of her footsteps remained. On the door was a single white notice taped neatly in the center. It bore the letterhead of Willow Holdings, property under redevelopment, all prior claims nullified. Her hands trembled as she tore the notice down, but it didn't matter. A dozen more were posted across the block, on lampposts, fences, and mailboxes. Her entire kingdom now bore his insignia. Meanwhile, the man moved with quiet precision. He knew revenge wasn't about destruction, it was about dominance. The HOA had taken something from him that couldn't be replaced, so he took everything they thought they owned. He didn't rebuild his home right away. Instead, he focused on transforming the land into something new, something that reflected the power balance that now defined the neighborhood. Streets were renamed, parks were redesigned, HOA bylaws were erased from city records. Even the neighborhood entrance sign that once read Willow Estates managed by the HOA was replaced with one simple phrase, private property. Every trace of the old regime was erased. But beneath the surface, Marlene refused to disappear quietly. In her desperation, she turned to the last weapon she had: public sympathy. She reached out to reporters, painting herself as a victim, claiming the HOA's actions were misinterpreted, that the demolition had been a tragic mistake. But the truth was too solid to bend. Legal documents surfaced, showing her signature on the demolition authorization. Emails proved she had pushed for strict enforcement to set an example. And in one damning piece of evidence, a recorded HOA meeting exposed her boasting about finally dealing with the non-compliant homeowner. Her empire wasn't collapsing. It was disintegrating piece by piece on live television. The neighborhood that once feared her now despised her. The man, watching it all unfold from his office window, felt no joy, only justice. Every brick laid on his new property was a reminder of balance restored. Every headline was a warning to those who abused power under the guise of community. By late summer, the first phase of his project was complete. The former HOA office had been replaced by a towering structure, sleek glass, black stone, and a red accent line running across the facade like a scar. It stood as a monument not to wealth, but to control reclaimed. The man walked through the site one evening, past the hum of machinery and the smell of wet concrete. He stopped at the center where his house once stood. Now in its place, a polished stone fountain had been built. Water cascaded gently over engraved words, "Property stands on truth." He watched the reflection of the sunset shimmer across it, a faint smile flickering across his face. The HOA had once erased him from the map. Now he had erased them from existence. But his story wasn't finished. The neighborhood had been reclaimed, but the reckoning wasn't over. Because one last piece remained unfinished, one final confrontation between power and pride. And when it came, it would not be quiet. The neighborhood once known as Willow Estates had become a construction zone of transformation, its uniform beauty stripped away, replaced by the relentless rhythm of progress. What had once been the pride of the HOA was now the stage for its destruction. The sound of drills and the echo of steel had replaced the chirping of morning birds. The air was thick with the scent of concrete dust, and the horizon shimmered with the silhouettes of cranes. Every resident who remained could feel the shift, not just in ownership but in atmosphere. The street no longer belonged to them. The rules they had once lived by, enforced by fear and fines, were gone. Now there was only one rule, his. From his glass office, the man watched everything unfold with calculated precision. His empire was expanding across the block, but his satisfaction wasn't drawn from profit or revenge, it came from balance. The HOA had once claimed to protect the community standard. Now, he was rewriting that standard in his own image, one property at a time. For months, Marlene Carter had stayed out of sight, her home surrounded by the chaos she could no longer control. The whispers of her downfall echoed in every conversation. She had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of how power without humility collapses under its own weight. But inside her fatting home, she refused to let go. Pride is a dangerous thing, and hers had become a poison. Late at night, she sat surrounded by old HOA documents, photographs of ribbon cuttings and neighborhood events, as if clinging to relics of her reign. Every certificate and framed award that once filled her with pride now felt hollow, like mocking reminders of what she had lost. Still, she wasn't ready to vanish quietly. Behind closed doors, Marlene began contacting anyone who might listen, lawyers, journalists, even city officials. She wanted to reclaim her name, to drag him into a public confrontation. She told herself that if she could just expose him, maybe she could win back some of the respect she had destroyed. But she was too late. The man had already anticipated her desperation. Every angle she could exploit had already been sealed, every potential ally already neutralized by fact, law, and quiet power. Her attempts to rally others only deepened her isolation. The city had moved on, the residents had moved out, and the name HOA was no longer a shield, it was a curse. Still, pride burned hotter than reason. And so, one evening, as the construction site glowed under floodlights, Marlene did the unthinkable. She crossed the street and stepped onto his land. Her heels sank into the soft earth as she walked past heavy equipment and silent workers, her once confident stride now shaky but defiant. She approached the new building, the one that had risen from the ruins of his home, and stood before it, staring at the engraved sign, Willow Holdings. Inside, through the glass, she could see him, calm, focused, reviewing blueprints beneath the sterile glow of office lights. He looked nothing like the man whose home she had ordered destroyed months ago. He looked untouchable. And that realization twisted something inside her. For years, she had been the one in control, the one issuing commands, signing fines, dictating appearances. Now she was nothing but a trespasser on land that used to symbolize her authority. She pounded her fist on the glass door, but no one answered. The workers watched from a distance, uncertain. Security stood quietly nearby but didn't intervene. There was no need to, because her fury meant nothing here. Eventually, she turned and stormed off, her heels clattering against the pavement, her anger echoing uselessly in the air. That night she went home and began writing letters, to the media, to former residents, to anyone who might care. Each one painted her as the victim of a powerful developer, twisting the story to hide her crimes. She told half-truths, omitted details, and blamed others. But the man didn't respond. He didn't counter her lies or release his own statement. He simply waited. Because he knew what she didn't. Her downfall was already complete. A few weeks later, her story reached local television. The segment aired once and disappeared, overshadowed by a bigger headline. HOA corruption scandal deepens, former president under investigation. Documents had surfaced, emails, records, and correspondence, leaked anonymously to investigators. They revealed how Marlene had funneled HOA funds into personal accounts, manipulated zoning permits for personal gain, and falsified reports to target homeowners she disliked. The very system she had used to destroy others had turned against her. In truth, it wasn't anonymous. It was him. He had uncovered everything while tracing property ownership records, and when the time was right, he handed it all over quietly, strategically, devastatingly. Within days, the investigation consumed her. Bank accounts were frozen, assets seized. She faced charges of fraud, forgery, and abuse of power. The community that once feared her now celebrated her downfall. As she was escorted out of her home by authorities, the last thing she saw before being driven away was his new building standing tall across the street, shimmering in the sunlight like a monument to justice. The sound of hammers and drills carried through the open car window as she disappeared down the street. For the man, that moment wasn't about revenge. It was closure. The HOA's power had been built on intimidation and deceit. He had dismantled it with patience and precision. But even as victory settled in, something deeper stirred within him, a sense of responsibility. The land now belonged to him entirely, yes, but it also carried a history. The same people who had turned against him were victims of the system Marlene had created. He couldn't erase the past, but he could reshape what came next. In the weeks that followed, the last remnants of the old neighborhood fell. Empty homes were demolished, lots cleared, and plans approved for a new community, one without homeowners associations, without arbitrary rules, without fear. The new Willow District would be open, independent, and privately managed under his vision. No fines, no unnecessary sawdust and new beginnings. The HOA's manicured perfection was gone. In its place, something far more genuine was taking shape, a district born not of control but of freedom. The man stood on the balcony of his new office, overlooking the transformation below. His posture was calm, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried the quiet intensity of someone who had endured destruction and turned it into legacy. Below him, teams of workers moved in synchronization. New foundations were being poured, where once the HOA had ruled with iron rules and polished smiles. Every trench dug into the ground felt symbolic, turning the soil that had witnessed arrogance, cruelty, and abuse of power into the groundwork for fairness and independence. The first phase of the Willow District was nearly complete. The once cookie-cutter houses had been replaced by diverse architectural styles, modern glass townhomes beside rustic cottages, urban lofts beside cozy single-family homes. It was a statement: individuality over conformity, choice over control. Each street had been renamed. Gone were the HOA-approved titles like Elm Circle and Harmony Lane. In their place came words with meaning: Justice Avenue, Renewal Road, Freedom Court. He had even renamed the Central Park, the one the HOA once claimed as their crown jewel. Now it was called Restoration Park. At its center stood the fountain he had commissioned, the one built on the ground where his home had been destroyed. Water cascaded over the inscription, "Property stands on truth," a reminder carved in stone for generations to come. The townspeople came to see it as the heart of the district, a place where children played, where families gathered, and where people remembered what the neighborhood once was, and what it had become. The media attention that had once been drawn by scandal had now shifted to admiration. News stations called it the Miracle on Willow Lane, a story of reclamation, justice, and transformation. They told of how a man, wronged by his own community, had not only restored what was his but had redefined the meaning of ownership. But he wasn't done yet. The final act of justice was quiet, private, almost poetic. When the HOA's remaining assets were liquidated by the court, he purchased every one of them at auction. The office furniture, the meeting tables, the framed Community of the Year plaques, all of it. To outsiders it seemed petty. To him it was closure. He stored them all in one of the newly built warehouses on the far end of the block, and on a crisp autumn morning, he visited the site alone. The sun cast long shadows through the open doors as he walked through the rows of stacked furniture and dusty nameplates. In the center of the room stood the old HOA sign, gleaming brass letters that once hung above the office entrance: Willow Estates Homeowners Association. He stared at it for a long moment, then gave a quiet nod to the foreman standing nearby. The man pressed a button. With a low hum, the industrial crusher began to move, and the sign that once symbolized oppression, arrogance, and deceit was reduced to shards of metal. The sound was deafening, final, a perfect echo of justice delivered. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply turned and walked away, the crushed emblem of the HOA glinting behind him like the last spark of a dying fire. From that day on, the HOA ceased to exist, not just legally but in memory. New families moved in, unaware of the power struggle that had once defined these streets. The old residents who remained told the story quietly, passing it down like a fable. They spoke of the man whose home was destroyed without warning, who returned not with vengeance but with vision. They called him the landlord of Willow. As the district flourished, his influence became legend. Investors sought his insight, city officials praised his integrity. But he remained the same, calm, quiet, deliberate. He never sought fame, only balance. Years later, when the final phase of the redevelopment was completed, the city held an unveiling ceremony in Restoration Park. The mayor gave a speech about justice and perseverance, about how destruction can lead to renewal. But when they invited the man to speak, he declined. Instead, he stood among the crowd, anonymous, watching as children played near the fountain, as the people he had once lived among finally enjoyed the freedom they had once denied him. As the ceremony ended, the sun began to set, painting the glass buildings in warm gold. The fountain shimmered, and for a brief moment the reflection of his old home seemed to flicker in the water, like a memory refusing to die. He lingered there, alone for a while, tracing the outlines of his past in the ripples. Then he turned and walked toward the horizon of his rebuilt block, where cranes stood still and lights began to glow across the new streets. The war had ended long ago. But the legacy of it, the lesson, remained carved in every brick, every sign, every drop of that cascading water. The HOA had bulldozed his house without warning, but they didn't know he owned the entire block. And now everyone knew what that meant. The land stood as proof that justice, though slow, always finds its ground. And in that quiet evening, as the city lights began to twinkle against the darkening sky, one truth echoed across Willow District: power built on arrogance will always fall. But power built on truth will always rise.